Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In the harsh heart of the American frontier, some stories are not born beside warm campfires, but forged through pain, endurance, and fate. This is the story of Ilyra Cross, a woman of intellect and refinement from Boston, who in 1876 disappeared into the forbidden mountains of the Dakota frontier. She had come in search of a flower, a fragile legend whispered among botanists and scholars. Instead, she encountered a man whose name chilled both settlers and soldiers alike. The warrior feared and spoken of in hushed tones. Varek. Lost and presumed dead, Ilyra Cross was not the helpless victim everyone imagined. Her true journey was only beginning, not as a casualty of the wilderness, but as the unwilling bride of the most feared man in the territory, a man whose spirit was as untamed and scarred as the land he defended. The year 1876 burned with tension across the frontier. The air, heavy with the scent of pine and the metallic promise of gold, carried unspoken danger. Yet for Ilyra Cross, the only fire in her blood was the pursuit of knowledge. Sharp-minded and resolute, she stood apart in the rough, lawless town of Deadwood, a figure too refined for a place ruled by greed and grit. While men tore into the earth in search of glittering ore, Ilyra Cross hunted a different treasure, the ghost orchid, Dendrophylax, a bloom so rare it was dismissed as myth, had become her obsession, the final mission to complete the unfinished legacy of her late father, the renowned botanist Ilyra Cross. She ignored every warning. Prospectors, their faces smeared with dirt and ambition, told her the mountains were no place for a woman. Soldiers stationed near Fort Laramie, their uniforms crisp but their eyes tired, spoke of displaced Apache tribes and rising tensions as miners pushed deeper into sacred lands. And they spoke of one warrior above all others, Varek, a name that silenced even the loudest saloons. They said he moved like a shadow, that his arrows never missed, and that he guarded the high peaks of the sacred mountains with ruthless devotion. The settlers called the range Crow's Peak, but to the Apache, it was a holy land, forbidden and revered. It was exactly where Ilyra Cross's final map led his daughter. Mounted on her sure-footed horse, Dusk, Ilyra Cross felt a surge of defiance. She was not a delicate Boston lady. She understood the land, could handle a rifle, and knew how to bind a wound. Her canvas satchel carried no perfume or lace, but sketchbooks, charcoal tools, a flower press, and her father's weathered journal. One line echoed in her mind like a vow. The ghost orchid blooms only where the spirit world touches the earth. Find it, my Ilyra. It will be our greatest discovery. For 2 days, she rode deeper into the frontier, leaving behind the noisy chaos of Deadwood. Silence closed around her, broken only by the distant cry of birds and the whisper of wind through towering pines. The land grew harsher with every mile. Rolling hills gave way to jagged stone spires clawing toward the sky. This was his territory. She felt it in her bones. A strange awareness crept over her, as if unseen eyes followed her every step. She tightened her grip on the reins. On the 3rd day, the sky changed without warning. Blue faded to iron gray in moments. The wind, once gentle, turned into a violent howl tearing through the canyons. A sudden blizzard swept across the mountains. Snow did not fall. It attacked, slashing sideways through the air. Within an hour, the world vanished into white chaos. Trails disappeared. Landmarks dissolved. Ilyra Cross dismounted, her hands numb, her confidence eroding with every gust that threatened to knock her down. Dusk, normally calm, grew frantic, eyes wide with fear. Ilyra Cross tried to guide her toward a rocky ledge, a fragile promise of shelter. Then a violent blast of wind struck. Snow and ice exploded through the air. Dusk reared violently, her hooves striking the air. The rein slipped from Ilyra Cross's frozen fingers. The horse bolted, swallowed by the storm in seconds. "Dusk!" Ilyra Cross's cry vanished in the wind. Fear pierced her like ice. Alone, on foot, on forbidden ground, in the heart of a blizzard. She stumbled through deepening snow, her body shaking uncontrollably. The cold became a living force, gnawing at her bones. Her orderly mind collapsed into a single instinct. Move, survive, don't stop. Then she fell. Her knee struck hidden rock with brutal force. Pain exploded through her leg. She cried out weakly, collapsing into the snow as the world spun into blinding white. She knew she was dying. The ghost orchid now felt like a foolish dream. Her father's memory flickered like a fading ember against the cold darkness closing in. Through the roar of the storm, another sound emerged, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. Not clumsy, not careless. She tried to reach for the revolver at her waist, but her body refused to respond. A figure rose before her, a dark silhouette against the storm. He was tall and broad, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak dusted with snow. Long black hair, braided with strips of fur, fell over his shoulders. His face was sharp, unforgiving, his skin burnished like copper, and his eyes, dark, unreadable, merciless, locked onto her as if measuring her fate. But it was his eyes that froze her breath before the storm ever could. They were dark, unwavering, stripped of mercy. The kind of gaze a hunter gives when fate has already been decided. He lowered himself beside her, every movement controlled, deliberate, precise. He did not reach out to save her. Instead, his hand moved with quiet speed, slipping the revolver from her belt as if he had done it 1,000 times before. His gaze shifted from her pale face to the endless, merciless mountains surrounding them. Then he spoke, short words, sharp and fluid, in a language that sounded both ancient and unyielding. She understood none of it, yet the meaning struck her with brutal clarity. This was Varek, and her fate had crossed his path. He lifted her from the snow with effortless strength, as though she weighed nothing at all. Her final clear thought was not of Boston, nor of her father, nor even of the flower she had chased into the wilderness. It was the unbearable truth of being carried away by the very man she had been warned to fear above all others. Her world did not dissolve into darkness, but into blinding white snow and the silent, unreadable eyes of the Apache warrior. The journey became a fevered blur. Ilyra Cross drifted between consciousness and oblivion, aware only of the rhythmic sway of motion, the heat of the heavy fur wrapped around her, and the solid, unyielding presence of the man who carried her. The storm roared without mercy, its voice a relentless chant. With every step he took, pain shot through her knee, anchoring her to reality. Time ceased to exist. There was only cold, pain, and the warrior. When they finally stopped, the storm's scream softened. She felt herself lowered onto something warm and soft. As her eyes fluttered open, she vaguely recognized the interior of a shelter. The air was warm, thick with the scent of firewood, smoked meat, and unfamiliar herbs. A small fire glowed at the center, its light casting trembling shadows across the hide-covered walls decorated with painted figures of horses and buffalo. A woman stepped inside. Her expression was stern, her presence commanding. She was older, streaks of gray woven through her dark hair, her movements swift and practiced. She spoke sharply to Varek in the same flowing, guttural language, her tone edged with suspicion as she gestured toward Ilyra Cross. He answered in a low voice, calm, yet authoritative. The woman fell silent, her gaze still hard as she turned toward Ilyra Cross. With firm but skilled hands, she cut away the soaked fabric from her leg, revealing a swollen, bruised knee. Ilyra Cross flinched, biting back a cry. The woman examined the injury, her touch unexpectedly gentle. She crushed leaves into a paste and pressed it against the wound. The cold shock faded into soothing warmth. Then she wrapped the knee tightly with strips of soft hide. For days, Ilyra Cross lay on the fur-covered bedding, trapped between pain and confusion, suspended in a world she did not understand. People came and went. Children with wide, curious eyes peeked inside before being scolded away by the stern woman. Ilyra Cross later learned her name was Enya. She was Varek's sister. Warriors entered the shelter in hushed tones, speaking to Varek with seriousness. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward Ilyra Cross, carrying a mix of curiosity and resentment. To them, she was an intruder, one of the people who had come to claim their land without permission or remorse. Varek remained a silent presence. He sat by the fire for hours, shaping arrowheads, repairing gear, his focus absolute. He rarely looked at her directly, yet she always felt his awareness. His stillness was unsettling. He was like a force held in restraint, a storm waiting to break. She noticed the strength in his shoulders, the sharp intelligence in his features, and the quiet sorrow that sometimes shadowed his face when he thought no one watched. He brought her food, thick stew of bison and wild roots in a wooden bowl, water in a leather pouch. He never spoke, and she, knowing none of his language, could not speak to him. The silence between them was vast, filled with fear, distrust, and uncertainty. One evening, nearly a week after her capture, when the pain in her knee had faded into a dull ache, the shelter flap opened. Varek entered, followed by an elder. The elder's face was carved with deep lines, his eyes calm and penetrating. He sat across from her while Varek stood near the entrance, arms folded, expression unreadable. The elder spoke, and to her astonishment, his words came in broken but understandable English. "He who walks with shadows brought you from the storm," the old man said, his voice dry and steady. "You are on sacred land. You should not have been there." Relief and frustration burned in Ilyra Cross's eyes. "There was a storm. My horse ran. I was lost. I am a botanist, a scientist. I meant no harm. I was searching for a plant." The elder translated her words. Varek listened without reaction, then answered in his own tongue. "He knows what you are," the elder said quietly. "He found your bag of drawings. He asks why one flower is worth a life." Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. "It was for my father." Her voice trembled as the words left her lips, each syllable weighed down by grief. "He was a great scientist. It was his life's work." Again, her words were carried across the fire in a language she could not understand. Varek finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond cold judgment. For a fleeting moment, there was recognition, perhaps even sorrow, a quiet echo of loss. "He says the mountain spirits spared you," Thoen said, his eyes fixed on Ilyra Cross. "They guided him to where you lay." "A life saved by the spirits cannot be wasted. It now belongs to the people." Ilyra Cross felt her heart hammer violently against her ribs. "What does that mean? When my knee heals, will you let me go? I can return to Deadwood. I know the way." Thoen turned to Varek, and a long silence passed between them, filled with words she could not hear, but somehow felt. At last, Varek spoke a single, firm sentence. Thoen exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking as if the weight of the decision pressed upon him. He faced her again, his expression darkened by pity. "You do not understand," he said quietly. "You are a woman alone. The miners would not spare you kindness. The soldiers would see you as trouble. You cannot return."
"I can't stay here," Ilyra Cross cried, panic breaking through her voice. "This is not my home. These are not my people."
Thoen lowered his voice. "Varek has lost much. His first wife, Asha, died in the winter cold. The spirits have sent you to thaw what was turned to stone. He has spoken before the council." A chill far deeper than the blizzard crept along Ilyra Cross's spine. "Spoken what?" Thoen looked at her with the sorrow of a man delivering an irreversible verdict. "He took you from the mountain. You carry its spirit. He will protect you. You will not be a captive," he said softly. "You will be his wife." The word hung in the smoky air, heavy, unreal, terrifying. Wife. Ilyra Cross stared at Varek, who stood unmoving, carved from silence and resolve. This was not an offer. It was not a question. It was a decree. She was not a guest. She was not a survivor. She was something claimed, something chosen to replace a ghost. The silence between them widened into an unbridgeable gulf. She was no longer merely lost. She had become property. The most feared Apache warrior had claimed her, and in this unforgiving land, his word was law. The days that followed Tayan's declaration became a quiet form of torment for Ilyra Cross. The word wife echoed in her mind like a discordant note in a song she did not belong to. She was Ilyra Cross of Boston, daughter of Rowan Cross, a woman of knowledge and science. Now she was expected to become the bride of a man the outside world would call savage. A man who had taken her freedom without ever speaking to her directly. Her first act of defiance was silence. When Varek entered the shelter, she turned her face to the wall. When Enya brought her food, she ate only enough to survive, refusing to meet the woman's cold gaze. She would not become a quiet prize. She would become a burden, sharp, difficult, impossible, until they tired of her and cast her out. But the Apache were masters of patience. Her silent rebellion was met not with anger, but with watchful calm. Life continued around her as if she were a storm they had learned to endure. Outside, Enya scraped hides with steady rhythm. Children's laughter drifted across the camp. Warriors rode out at dawn and returned at dusk, carrying grim news of lands being taken and treaties broken. Life in the camp unfolded like a living tapestry, intricate and interconnected. And despite herself, Ilyra Cross, the scientist, began to observe. She saw the reverence with which they treated the buffalo, using every part of the animal. She witnessed the tenderness of a father's voice to his child, the respect shown to elders. It was a world shaped by community and spirit, utterly unlike the greedy chaos of Deadwood. Under Enya's care, her knees slowly healed. The poultices were changed daily. Soon she could stand, then limp, then walk with the help of a carved wooden staff. The camp rested in a hidden valley, a circle of hide shelters guarded by towering peaks. The air was clean, sharp, alive. The mountains watched in silence. One afternoon, a small boy approached her. He could not have been more than 5 years old. His eyes were bright with curiosity. He had been watching her for days. He pointed at the delicate floral embroidery on the sleeve of her torn dress and spoke a word softly. "Wale." He frowned, trying again. "Waka." He pointed once more insistently. "Waka."
For a moment, Ilyra Cross forgot her vow of distance. She smiled gently and corrected him. Flower. The boy's face lit up. Flower. And in that single word, something inside her shifted. He tried again, twisting the sound awkwardly, yet his face glowed with pride.
Then he pointed toward a tall pine standing at the edge of the valley. Ilyra Cross smiled faintly and gave him the word, tree. He lifted his finger toward the sky, then the sun, then a dog trotting past the shelters. Slowly, this became their daily ritual. The boy called Yoro became her first bridge into this unfamiliar world. Each day, Yoro brought her small offerings, a smooth stone, a feather, a strip of bark, and she would offer him the English word in return. And with the natural ease of childhood, he shared words from his own language. Through Yoro, the silence that had surrounded Ilyra Cross began to fracture. Other children, encouraged by his courage, sometimes joined their quiet lessons. From a distance, Enya watched these exchanges, her rigid expression softening in ways so subtle they were almost invisible. But the true turning point came weeks later. A sickness crept through the camp like an unseen enemy. It began with coughing, sharp, relentless, and quickly grew into fever that struck hardest among the youngest and the oldest. Yoro was one of the first to fall ill. The tribe's healer, Mokar, an ancient man with weathered skin and eyes like ash, performed rituals through the night, chanting and shaking rattles beneath the flickering firelight. Yet the boy's condition worsened. His breathing grew shallow, his small body burned with fever. Ilyra Cross watched, her scientific mind battling her fear of overstepping her place. She recognized the signs. It resembled the illness that had swept through Boston's poorest districts the previous winter. She remembered fragments of her father's research, notes on traditional plant remedies he had studied among indigenous communities. That night, while Yoro's mother wept quietly inside the shelter, Ilyra Cross made a decision. Leaning on her walking stick, she limped beyond the circle of the camp and into the surrounding forest, a place she had never dared to enter alone. Under the pale glow of the full moon, she searched. Her botanical knowledge, once used for academic pursuit, had become a desperate tool for survival, and perhaps for belonging. Near the edge of a creek, she found what she sought: wild cherry bark and clusters of mullein, their leaves soft and pale beneath her fingers. When she returned, she went straight to Varek's shelter. He was inside, repairing a bowstring with steady hands. She held out the bark and leaves. "Help," she said in English, the word awkward on her tongue. Then she spoke one of the few words that truly mattered to her now. "Yoro." "Sick." She pressed a hand to her chest, mimicking a cough, then pointed toward the plants. Varek looked from the leaves to her face. For the first time, he did not see a defiant captive. He saw a woman driven by urgency. And for the first time, he looked past her pale skin and unfamiliar clothes and recognized the knowledge in her eyes. He stood and led her toward Yoro's shelter. Inside, the air was heavy with sickness and grief. Mokar watched her with open hostility as she entered. But Varek spoke quietly, and the old healer stepped aside, his gaze filled with suspicion. Working quickly, Ilyra Cross crushed the bark and steeped it with mullein leaves in hot water, creating a dark, aromatic brew. She waited for it to cool. Then, lifting Yoro's head gently, she coaxed him to drink small sips. She stayed beside him through the night, feeding him the tea, pressing cool cloths to his forehead. From the shadows, Varek and Enya watched in silence. They saw her gentleness, her focus, her exhaustion. This was not the work of a captive. It was the work of a healer. Near dawn, something extraordinary happened. Yoro's fever broke. His breathing, though still uneven, lost its terrifying shallowness. He slipped into a deep, peaceful sleep. When the sun rose, pouring golden light into the valley, Ilyra Cross stumbled out of the shelter, drained but relieved. Enya was waiting. Her expression was unreadable, yet she held out a piece of warm fry bread. As Ilyra Cross accepted it, Enya's hand brushed hers for a brief moment. The gesture was fleeting, but it meant more than months of silence. It was the first spark of acknowledgement. Later that day, Varek approached Ilyra Cross as she sat outside the shelter. He stood before her in silence, the space between them stretching unbearably long. Then he spoke, not in his language, in slow, carefully shaped English words. "The boy lives." His voice was rough, unused to the language. Ilyra Cross looked up, stunned. "You speak English?" "A little," he said quietly. "From traders, soldiers." He paused. "Why? Why what? Why you help?" "He's a child," Ilyra Cross answered simply. "He was sick." Varek studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for something beyond words. "You have a strong heart," he said at last, as though the realization surprised him. Then he knelt, and with the tip of his knife, drew shapes in the dirt. One was a flower with long, trailing petals, the ghost orchid. The other was a crude figure of a man. He pointed to the flower, then to the sky, then to the figure. Finally, he pointed to her. Ilyra Cross stared at the drawings, her breath catching as understanding began to unfold. He was not merely telling her that he knew what she sought. The meaning was deeper, and far more unsettling. In the eyes of the spirits, the flower meant for the warrior was not something growing from the earth. It was her. The warrior's decision had not been driven by simple desire or conquest, but by something far deeper, by the storm, by the mountain, by signs he believed could not be ignored. Her arrival was not an accident. It was destiny, shaped by forces she had never meant to awaken. She had come searching for a sacred bloom, and in the belief of the Apache, she had become that bloom herself. While Ilyra Cross struggled to carve out a fragile existence in the hidden Apache camp, the world she had left behind did not forget her. Or rather, one man refused to. Back in Deadwood, Dorian Pike spoke her name with bitterness. He was a man molded from the same ruthless soil as the town he now controlled, handsome in a dangerous way, his mustache carefully trimmed, his gaze sharp as cold steel. To the world, he had presented himself as Ilyra Cross's most devoted admirer, but in truth, he had never seen her as an equal. She was an opportunity. Her Boston upbringing, her intellect, and her family's modest fortune were merely tools he intended to use to polish his own ambition. Her disappearance was not a tragedy to him. It was an irritation. Worse than that, it was a threat. The map Ilyra Cross had shown him, the copy of the one she carried, had been his true objective. He had no interest in her ghost orchid. What fascinated him was the land itself. Humors whispered that the sacred mountains hid more than rare flowers. They concealed veins of gold, untouched by the greed of Deadwood. Ilyra Cross had been his perfect disguise. Her scientific expedition gave him a reason to study the terrain without suspicion. Now she was gone, and with her the original map, and the excuse he needed to be there. "She's dead," Dorian Pike declared one night in the crowded haze of the number 10 saloon. "Taken by the storm, or worse, taken by Varek and his savages." He slammed his fist against the bar, sending glasses rattling across the rough wood.
That woman had all her books and learning, but no sense. Rode straight into Crow's Peak. A murmur passed through the miners and trappers. They knew the name Varek. They knew the reputation of the mountain. But she was a lady, Dorian Pike continued, his voice shifting into a tone of righteous anger. A woman from the East. We can't let her memory be dragged through the mud.
And we can't let those heathens sit on land that could hold a fortune.
He leaned forward, lowering his voice.
We form a party. We ride up there. We recover her body.
He paused, curling his fingers in the air as if shaping invisible words.
And while we're there, we see what those devils are guarding so fiercely.
Greed spread through the room faster than grief ever could. To seal the deal, Dorian Pike promised a share of anything they found.
He hired the finest tracker he could locate, a lean, silent man named Halvor Reed, and recruited a dozen of the most ruthless guns Deadwood had to offer, men who would kill for boots and ask questions later. Within a week, the search party rode out of Deadwood. They carried more ammunition and mining tools than supplies from morning. At their head rode Dorian Pike, the duplicate map hidden beneath his oilskin coat. He felt no remorse, only calculation. If he found her alive, she would become a problem. Part of him almost hoped she was dead. It would make everything easier. The journey was brutal. Halvor Reed moved with uncanny precision, reading the land as if it spoke directly to him. He found the place where a horse had bolted, the faint marks in the snow where a body had fallen.
She was here, Halvor Reed said quietly. And she wasn't alone. He pointed toward the wilderness. Shod horse went that way.
Then he pointed upward along the twisting mountain path. Moccasins. One man carrying weight. That way.
Apache. Varek. Dorian Pike spat the name like poison. He has her. Or her body. It makes no difference, Halvor Reed replied, his expression unreadable. Dorian Pike's eyes gleamed. It makes every difference. He's on our land now. Let's move. They pushed deeper into the sacred hills. They moved clumsily, loudly, in stark contrast to the quiet land they invaded.
They cut young trees for firewood, left their fires smoldering, and shot deer they never intended to eat, killing for sport alone. They were a scar across untouched wilderness. One afternoon, Halvor Reed raised a hand, halting the group. He dismounted and knelt, studying the ground. Then he lifted a small, intricately beaded pouch. "Medicine pouch," he said, "dropped by an Apache scout." His voice lowered. "They're watching us. They've been watching us since we left the lowlands." Unease rippled through the men. This was no saloon brawl. This was Apache land. Varek's land.
Dorian Pike laughed harshly. "Let them watch. Let the devil see civilization coming." He drew his new revolver, its polished metal flashing in the sunlight. "They can't hide from progress," he said coldly. "And we have better medicine than they do." They continued their ascent until they reached a high plateau that matched a marking on Dorian Pike's map.
Below them lay a hidden valley, sheltered from the wind. And somewhere within it, the woman he believed he had lost, and the destiny he intended to claim, were waiting. Through his spyglass, Dorian Pike could barely discern thin trails of smoke rising from the distant campfires.
"There they are," he said, his voice edged with triumph, a cold smirk twisting his lips. "Hiding like animals in a burrow." He turned toward his men. "We set camp here. Let the horses breathe. Then we move down."
His gaze hardened. "We'll demand Ilyra Cross back.
If they refuse... He paused deliberately, letting silence speak for him. We'll take her anyway, and everything else we find. He lifted his hand toward the mountain. Remember the gold, boys. This mountain is a vault, and we hold the key. As his men built their rough camp, filling the sacred plateau with noise and filth, Dorian Pike stood alone at the edge of the ridge, staring down into the valley.
In his mind, Ilyra Cross was already there, captured, powerless. The thought of her beside an Apache warrior ignited a possessive fury inside him. She belonged to him, and someone had stolen what was his. He would reclaim her, and he would claim the gold. The Apache, their holy mountain, their very existence, nothing more than barriers in his path. And Dorian Pike had always been skilled at destroying barriers. The serpent had entered the garden, and it was ready to strike. The Apache camp sensed danger long before Dorian Pike saw their smoke. A scout who had dropped his medicine pouch came running back with urgent news. More than a dozen armed white men, led by one whose eyes burned with icy fire, were climbing the mountain. They were not lost wanderers. They moved with intention. They were a force. A heavy tension spread through the camp. Children's laughter faded into silence. Women worked with frantic speed, gathering food and supplies. Warriors gathered around the central fire, their expressions severe as they listened to Varek. His voice was calm, controlled, yet filled with the weight of coming conflict. He spoke of defense, of guarding sacred passes, of protecting women and children. From a distance, Ilyra Cross watched. She understood only fragments of his words, but she understood the fear. These were not the monsters described in cheap frontier stories. They were families. People preparing to defend their home from an enemy they knew would show no mercy. That evening, the air inside Varek's teepee felt heavy. He sat cleaning his Winchester rifle, a weapon taken from a soldier long ago. His movements were precise, deliberate, but tension coiled in his shoulders. Months had passed since Ilyra Cross arrived in the camp. The distance between them had slowly narrowed. They spoke in broken English and halting Apache, building a fragile bridge of understanding. Yet the deepest part of him remained sealed. "They come for you," he said without looking up, his English careful and measured. "They come for gold," Ilyra Cross replied softly. "The man leading them, Dorian Pike, believes this mountain holds treasure. I am only his excuse." Varek finally lifted his eyes. "He is from your town, the man who wanted you." She nodded, shame warming her cheeks. "He sees people as things to own." Varek released a low sound of bitter recognition. "They believe everything can be owned, land, water, even a woman." Silence followed. His gaze drifted inward, toward memories he rarely touched. After a moment, Ilyra Cross spoke again. "Enya told me about Asha, and your son." The name hung in the air like a ghost. The walls around him seemed to rise higher. He did not answer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I lost my father too. I know what it means to live with a wound that never closes." For a long time, only the fire spoke. She thought she had gone too far, trespassed on grief too sacred to share. Then he spoke. His voice was thick with pain he had never released. "The sickness came in winter," Varek said, eyes fixed on the flames. "The bluecoats brought it. They gave us blankets at the agency. A gift of peace, they said." He let out a hollow laugh. "The blankets came from their sick houses. They carried death." He swallowed.
Asha was strong. She fought. But our son, Kiro, he was so small.
His breath trembled. I was away hunting. When I returned, the teepee was silent.
He stared at his hands, hands capable of war, yet powerless against fate.
Mokar tried to save them, but the spirits had already called them home.
His voice dropped to a whisper.
I could not hold them. I could not protect them.
The feared Apache warrior stood exposed before her, not as a legend, but as a grieving husband and father. And in the silence that followed, his story was not yet finished.
He slowly turned his arm, revealing a line of long, pale scars across his forearm, nearly lost beneath his sun-darkened skin. When an Apache man's heart breaks, Varek said, his voice rough and low, he does not hide his pain. He carves it into his own flesh. He gives his grief a body. He offers his suffering to the spirits.
His fingers traced the scars with quiet reverence.
My heart carries many wounds you will never see. Tears slid down Ilyra Cross's cheeks. Tears for him, for his lost family, for the cruelty of fate. In that moment he was not a captor, not a feared warrior, but a man drowning in sorrow she understood too well. She stepped closer. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his. Her slender fingers rested against his scarred, powerful hand. The gesture was simple, yet deeply human. He did not pull away. Instead, his hand turned, his fingers gently closing around hers. When the storm came, Varek said, his voice softer now, and I found you on the mountain, half dead. I thought the spirits were mocking me, sending me another woman to lose. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. But you did not die. You fought. You healed Yoro. You learned our words. You are not like the others.
And you are not the savage they describe, Ilyra Cross replied, her voice trembling with emotion. He held her gaze.
The elder said the spirits sent you to soften the stone in my heart. I did not believe him. A man's heart does not soften twice.
His fingers tightened around hers, gently.
I was wrong.
The decree that she would become his wife, once a terrifying fate, now felt different. It was no longer about ownership, it was about protection, about destiny, about two broken souls finding unexpected refuge in one another.
Their bond was not forged by law or ritual, but by shared loss and fragile respect. He released her hand and rose. The warrior's mask returned to his face, yet his eyes carried a new light. They will come at dawn, Varek said. They want to tear the heart from this mountain. They want to destroy what is sacred to us. He lifted his rifle. They will fail. This is our home. He looked at her. Now it is your home too. You must stay with the women and children in the caves behind the waterfall. You will be safe there.
No, Ilyra Cross said, rising to her feet, her voice firm. I will not hide. Dorian Pike does not know this mountain. I do. I studied my father's maps for years. I know the terrain, the passes, the rock falls. I can help. Varek stared at her, shock and admiration crossing his face. She was no longer the frightened captive he had carried from the snow.
She was no longer the silent stranger who had defied him with quiet strength. She was a woman of courage and intellect, offering her knowledge as a weapon. This is not your battle, he said, though his protest lacked conviction.
He is here because of me, she replied. That makes it my battle too. You fight for your home. Let me help you defend it." He saw the unbreakable resolve in her eyes. The spirits had not sent him a replacement for his lost wife. They had sent him an ally. Slowly, solemnly, he nodded. The fortress had been breached. The stone in his heart had not only softened, it had found a reason to beat again. At dawn, they would face the invaders not as captor and captive, but as partners. Dawn rose over the black peaks, painting the granite ridges in shades of rose and gold, a peaceful beauty that concealed the violence ahead. In the valley, the Apache camp moved with quiet precision. The elders, women, and children had already been guided to the hidden caves, their faces marked by a familiar, weary fear. The warriors, their faces marked with war paint, slipped through the pines like shadows, taking positions planned the night before by Varek and Ilyra Cross. She stood beside him on a rocky ledge, overlooking the main path into the valley. She no longer wore her torn Boston dress. Instead, she was dressed in buckskin leggings and a tunic given to her by Enya. Her hair was tightly braided, her skin darkened by sun and wind. She looked as though she belonged to the wilderness itself. In her hands, she carried not a rifle, but her father's detailed map, now filled with her own markings. "They will come along the main game trail," Ilyra Cross said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "It is the widest route for a large group on horseback. Dorian Pike is arrogant. He will choose the most direct path. And he will find my warriors waiting among the rocks," Varek said, his eyes scanning the trail below. "But a man like Dorian Pike is not only arrogant," he added quietly. "He is dangerous." "He is greedy," Ilyra Cross corrected, "and greed makes men predictable." She hesitated, then added, "But he has a tracker. His name is Halvor Reed." "He is not predictable," Ilyra Cross said quietly. "He will likely scout the flanks." She pointed toward a narrow, dangerous goat path cutting along the eastern ridge. "If I were him, I would use that trail to climb above your position." Varek nodded, clearly impressed by her insight. He lifted his hand and released a sharp bird call, a signal answered instantly from the trees.
Two of his strongest warriors slipped away from the main line, vanishing into the forest. The sun climbed higher. The morning air grew warmer. Then they heard it, the clatter of horseshoes on stone, the rough murmur of men's voices breaking the sacred silence. Dorian Pike's group appeared at the base of the trail, a dark scar against the untouched landscape. They rode with careless confidence, rifles resting loosely in their hands. Dorian Pike led them, his spyglass fixed on the valley below. "Looks quiet," one man called out. "Maybe they ran." "They're here," Dorian Pike replied, his voice carrying through the still air. "They're just hiding. Flush them out." A man raised his rifle and fired into the sky. The crack split the valley, a sound of pure violation. It was the signal. From the rocks above, the first volley of arrows flew. Silent, deadly. 3 men fell from their saddles before they understood they were under attack. Chaos erupted. Miners and hired guns, more familiar with saloon fights than real combat, panicked. They fired wildly into the rocks, bullets ricocheting with sharp, angry screams. Varek lifted his rifle and fired once. Another man collapsed from his horse. The battle had begun. It was not a fair fight. It was a merciless ambush. The Apache warriors were masters of the terrain. They struck, vanished, reappeared, moving like shadows shaped by the mountain itself. To his credit, Dorian Pike did not panic. "Take cover!" he roared. "Form a line!" But his men were falling too fast. As Ilyra Cross had predicted, Halvor Reed had broken away from the main group. She saw him briefly, a dark figure scrambling up the very goat path she had identified.
The two warriors Varek had sent were already closing in. A short, brutal struggle unfolded beyond sight. Then came a single sharp cry, abruptly cut off. Halvor Reed's skill had met superior force. On the main trail, the fight was turning into a collapse. Dorian Pike's men were trapped. Horses screamed in terror. Numbers dwindled. His face twisted with dark fury as he realized his mistake. He had underestimated his enemy. "The woman!" he suddenly shouted, his eyes scanning the cliffs above. He had seen Ilyra Cross standing beside Varek.
The sight of her alive and aligned with the Apache shattered his control.
"Ilyra, it's me," Dorian Pike yelled. "I came to save you." "I don't need saving," Ilyra Cross replied. Her voice was clear, unwavering, carrying across the valley. To Dorian Pike, it felt like betrayal. This was no longer about gold, it was about pride. He saw Varek beside her, a figure of defiance against everything he believed he owned. Raising his Colt Peacemaker, he took careful aim. "Dorian, no!"
Ilyra Cross cried, seeing his intention. She moved on instinct. She shoved Varek, driving him hard against the rock face just as the pistol exploded. The bullet meant for his heart tore instead through the flesh of her shoulder. Pain, white, burning, unbearable, ripped through her body. She cried out, stumbling backward, her hand flying to the wound and returning slick with blood. Seeing her fall, Varek released a roar of raw, primal rage. It was the cry of a man who had already lost one family and refused to lose another. He rose from behind the rock, ignoring the bullets striking around him, and leveled his Winchester. He did not aim at Dorian Pike. He aimed above him. His shot was perfect. The bullet struck the granite ridge, and a heartbeat later, a section of cliff, loosened by years of wind and ice, fractured and collapsed. Tons of rock and earth thundered down onto the trail. It was not a massive landslide, but it was enough. The path was completely blocked. Dorian Pike was cut off from his remaining men. Seeing their leader trapped and the mountain itself falling upon them, his men broke. They turned their horses and fled, galloping wildly back the way they had come, abandoning him. Varek did not pursue them. He turned toward Ilyra Cross. His face was a storm of fury and fear. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it firmly against her bleeding shoulder, his touch unexpectedly gentle.
"He will pay," Varek growled, his eyes burning with a fire she had never seen before. "He will pay for touching you." "We must stop the bleeding," Ilyra Cross whispered, her scientific mind fighting through the haze of pain. But Varek's gaze had already returned to the trail below.
Dorian Pike was clawing his way over the shattered rocks, dragging himself toward them. His face was twisted with hatred, his pistol still clenched in his hand. The battle for the mountain was finished. Now came the fight for its soul. The world shrank to the narrow, broken trail between two men. Dorian Pike staggered forward across the rock slide, his expression carved from fury and obsession. Above him, Varek stood motionless. He saw Ilyra Cross slumped against the stone wall, blood darkening her shoulder, and his choice was instant. Instead of lifting his rifle, he let it fall to the ground. Slowly, deliberately, he drew his hunting knife. It was not a gesture of rage. It was a challenge. Seeing this as arrogance, Dorian Pike shoved his pistol back into its holster and advanced, pulling out his heavy Bowie knife. The duel began in silence. Dorian Pike's blade struck with raw power, each swing driven by brute force and wounded pride. But Varek moved with the fluid precision of a predator born to this land. He stepped aside, parried, and countered, his knife flashing like lightning. His strikes were small but relentless, carving shallow wounds that drained strength and shattered confidence.
Breathing hard, anger boiling over, Dorian Pike grew reckless. He fainted, then hurled a fistful of gravel into Varek's eyes. Blinded, the warrior stumbled back. Dorian Pike surged forward and slammed into him, driving him to the ground. He pinned Varek, his bowie knife raised high for the killing blow. "It's over, savage," he gasped. A cry broke the moment. Ignoring the pain in her wounded shoulder, Ilyra Cross had stumbled forward, a heavy rock clutched in her hand. Dorian Pike's head turned for a fraction of a second. That single heartbeat was all Varek needed. With explosive strength, he twisted his body, seized Dorian Pike's wrist, and wrenched it sideways. A sickening crack shattered the silence of the valley. Dorian Pike screamed as his knife slipped from his broken hand. In the next instant, Varek was on top of him, his own blade pressed against the trembling man's throat. The fury in his eyes burned cold and merciless. He looked from Dorian Pike's terrified face to Ilyra Cross. Her gaze did not demand revenge. It begged for mercy. After a long moment, Varek rose. He kicked Dorian Pike's knife into the abyss and spoke a single word. "Go." Dorian Pike fled, a shattered man, cast out from the sacred mountain. Varek gently removed the rock from Ilyra Cross's hand and lifted her into his arms, carrying her back toward the camp. As her wound slowly healed, the last traces of her former life faded, washed away by the quiet rhythm of the valley. Weeks later, when her strength had returned, Varek guided her high into the mountains to a secluded grove wrapped in mist. There, suspended like a spirit among ancient pines, bloomed the ghost orchid. Tears streamed down Ilyra Cross's face. She had fulfilled her father's quest, but its meaning had changed forever. The flower was no longer a scientific prize destined for distant halls of Boston. It was a symbol of her new life, rare, resilient, sacred, and fiercely protected. She leaned against the warrior who was now her husband, her shelter, her home. She had come to the mountains seeking discovery, and instead found destiny. Ilyra Cross's journey, from a scholar of the East to a respected member of the Apache people, stood as proof that life's currents are never predictable, and love can reshape every boundary. She had searched for a fragment of her past, hoping to honor Rowan Cross, but instead discovered her entire future in the most unexpected place. Her story reminds us that home is not always where we are born, but where we are truly understood. It challenges the lines between civilization and wilderness, revealing that honor, courage, and love are not owned by any culture or race. What do you think of Ilyra Cross's final choice? Could you have made the same decision? To leave everything behind for a new life and an unexpected love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of survival, conflict, and connection moved you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who loves powerful historical tales, and subscribe for more dramatic stories from the untamed American West.